This is a second installation of a series of 3, sponsored by the National Lawyers Guild, the Northwest Constitutional Rights Center, and the First Unitarian Church. So this forum was inspired by the recent indictments and arrests of environmental activists and the label as terrorist, eco-terrorist, that's been used very broadly. These forums are intended to take a deeper look at the overall effects of the arrests, as well as providing context for them, and just getting into a deeper dialogue about what this means, deeper than you'd say finding the Oregonian. So we have 4 wonderful speakers, and it's not just going to be a time to sit and listen to them. The whole second half of this evening will be a time to discuss, both ask questions to the speakers, share your own observations, as I'm sure many of you in here have had experiences and are also living through the green scare that's happening. And 2 weeks ago, we discussed the terrorist creep. This week, we're focusing on the particular impact and attack that the federal government targets on environmental and also animal rights activists. But tonight we're really focusing on the environmental movement and how the government systemically targets, infiltrates, oppresses, and otherwise disrupts environmentalists and the environmental movement, while at the same time coddling, subsidizing, and otherwise encouraging corporate environmental crime. Kind of contrasting the two and really painting a picture of the, as Kim will say, the evil impact of capitalism on the whole system. The speakers tonight include a number of my heroes in the movement, and it's really a privilege to have them all here at one table speaking to us. First will be Kim Marks. She's an organizer for forest ethics and a longtime defender of Cascadia's forests. Then will be Ben Rosenfeld. He's a civil rights attorney from San Francisco and a board member of the CLDC, the Civil Liberties Defense Center, which is located in Eugene. Then we have Dan Saris, who's the program director for Friends of Living Oregon Waters. Then Barbara Dudley, who's an organizer with the Working Families Party and a professor at Portland State, also the former directors of Greenpeace and the National Lawyers Guild.
I was asked to give this huge overview of corporations destroying the earth, government allowing them to get away with it, and of course or turning a blind eye to the destruction of the corporations are doing, and the oppression that comes down on political activists. Okay, so that's no small feat, and I can't accomplish that all here tonight. There's books upon books upon books, and documentaries and movies, and I believe whole, seminars and college, campuses based on this type of topic. So what I can do is hope to touch on it and hope to inspire you to get more educated on it. But at the same time, I'm speaking in Portland, Oregon, so chances are 2/3 of you know more about this than I do. So let's see how I do. I guess I want to start off by naming how I perceive the problem, and that's capitalism. And a long time ago, democracy was replaced by what I believe is corporate rule. And and now we live in a time where corporations have more right and powers than any of us in the room have, unless you are maybe a spy for the government or a part of the 1% ruling class who's here checking out what we have to say. But what I feel like is capitalism needs 2 legs to stand on, and they've been standing on it for a really long time. And in order for capitalism to maintain the control it has, they need to control the people and they need to control the land. And there's a lot of historical stuff to go through, which I will not do that to you tonight. But just to kind of run through it, in order for it to get its stronghold on our society, it had to go through, it needed cheap labor, so we had slave labor. And then, okay, we abolished slavery over here, or we neatly packed it up, moved it to another country, and call it sweatshops now. Anyone with enough money and guns had the ability to move anybody out of the commons in Europe and take that land as their own. And now we see examples of losing more of our commons here in the Pacific Northwest, or actually across the United States with our U.S. public lands, where corporations are, where the U.S. government is, drawing lines around our commons, our U.S. public lands, and, auctioning it off to, giving it away to corporations at the cost to the people, where maybe we're not being removed and homelessness is not being created for us by giving away our public lands, but it is for the animals that live there, and it's still our land, which we are paying and subsidizing the U.S. government to give away to the corporations. And then we get back into the control of the land. Since capitalism has been in place, since we've had corporate dominance of our land, we've had over 80% of our land mass has been logged, of our forested ecosystems have been destroyed. Over half of our waters we can't swim in, we can't eat out of, we can't drink. The air pollution is getting worse and worse every year. Portland made number 3, right? Number 3 city? That seems ridiculous to me. And every year there's more and more drilling for oil, more and more mining going on, and we have the privatization of our land. Did I do that? Oh, so I was going to try to sum this up by saying there's these 3 stages that you go through when you're dealing with a problem if you're an addict. Because I would challenge and say corporate America is addicted. They're addicted to power, they're addicted to money, and they're addicted to control. And so when people are confronted with having to change, there's these 3 stages, right? First you go through denial, then you go through anger, and then you go through acceptance. I feel right now we're in the anger stage, but we definitely hang on. Corporate America holds on tightly to the denial stage as well. And I feel like it's safe to say that we're in denial. Over 60% of the people in the US value forests. They consider themselves environmentalists. Yet every second, an area the size of the Orange Bowl Stadium is logged, which breaks down to 23 million acres a year. We only have 4% of our native forests left here in the lower 48, yet the Bush administration is giving more and more of it away to corporations to log, not restore, not to rewild, not to create habitat for endangered species. Bush had to steal the election, not 1, 2. And even still, he is the most unpopular president since the Nixon era during the Watergate scandal. And yet, he moves forward. The agencies that we put in place to regulate and protect the environment allows corporations to blindly get away, like the Environmental Protection Agency allows people to get away, with corporations to get away with polluting our waters every day. Less than a quarter of the industries that pollute our riverways and our sewage treatment centers are fined, and the fines are so small and so minimal that most corporations would rather just take the financial fine and keep polluting the riverways and other ecosystems as well. In some places like Brazil or Indonesia, 80% of the logging that is happening illegally and imported into the U.S. And instead, we have a government, instead of addressing the problems and creating solutions that will create real change, we have them grasping at straws to grasp at anything they can to help stabilize their situation. And hence you have genetically engineered food and trees to help, trees that they think might survive climate change instead of dealing with climate change and trying to help protect the earth and the wild places. And the list just goes on and on of environmental offenses, and I just think that we're all quite familiar with them. But I think that when you, as a people or as a corporation, and you put things into place, you have systems in place, and you realize they're no longer working for you, or the lies that you've told yourself about what you're doing for your company, or how these short-term profits are really what you need to be doing, or you're doing this for your family, or the Bible says I can, or whatever lies that you've told yourself or that you believe are no longer working for you, move into this other stage of dealing with the problem, and you either start to fix the problems in your life or you move into anger, which is where I feel like our government and the corporations are kind of at today, is what we're seeing. And I sat down, I spent a few days trying to figure out what to bring to you all tonight to talk about the human rights violations that corporations do against the people, and it's so many that I could not do any one country or any one people or any one area justice by trying to rattle off a list. It's just countless. The corporations have their lapdogs too. Well, okay, so that's rhetoric. They have their lapdogs, the military, the FBI, the local police forces in any country and city or place that they operate in to do their bidding for them. At any place you have people standing up for their land, their culture, the commons, their homes, anywhere across the globe, you have corporations that are working with the government, with the military, with the feds, and in sometimes with big corporate environmental groups to give the sign-off to allow them to come in, remove the people, jail the people, in some cases torture and kill the people, and then just go about destroying the land. And yes, it's happening all over the world, but the corporations are mostly ours. I kind of feel like they're our garbage, so we need to clean them up. so to speak, do a little spring cleaning. You have corporations like Boise Cascade, Shell, Chevron, Coca-Cola, who, just to name a few, who are responsible for killing people who have stood up to them in peaceful manners to protect their land. We have local stuff like Gypsy, who was killed in the redwoods by a logger, dropped a tree on them. And we have a system in place where the public, where the public district attorney, help me out with the lawyer stuff.
Yeah.
When the district attorney refused to look into it, he refused to prosecute. I think in his report, he's like, well, sometimes people die, which, okay, he's not wrong, but someone was murdered, and because Pacific Lumber was doing the logging, and because they have cops in Humboldt County that are in their back pocket, they weren't even willing to look at it as a crime. Years earlier in the same county, we saw police officers swiping pepper spray on the eyelids of, 16-year-old nonviolent protesters. And we just seen the police get away with huge crimes against the people to, serve the purpose of these corporations. In 1990, Judy Berry, great example, was, she was bombed by the FBI. They ran out there. At this point in time, the FBI was dying to show that Earth First was a violent organization. They had sent infiltrators into Arizona to try to get the Arizona Earth First crowd to blow something up, and even with an infiltrator, they weren't able to pull that off. However, they were able to set people up and send them to jail for a very long time. And of course, just recently we had the big victory, which are you going to talk about that?
About the bombing case? I might save it for a question and answer.
All right, well, in which case we kicked the FBI's ass and they had to admit that they bombed Judy Berry. Okay, see awesome videos, sorry. And we see that it's just desperate times. They're just getting more and more angry and more desperate to try to control and contain, I say the movement, I mean anybody who's resisting or trying to create change in any facet. And we see the groups like the Wise Youth Movement who popped out with their spokespeople like Ron Arnold, who have quotes saying that they are going to destroy and eradicate the environmental movement. Full of anger, full of infiltration. They have target lists and websites. And in the face of all this struggle where this whole movement rose up to destroy the environmental movement, what are they destroying? Are they trying to destroy 60% of the American people who say what they want? They consider themselves environmentalists? I think that they've just been getting more and more desperate, grabbing at straws. They've been stripping more and more of our civil rights away, giving heavier and heavier sentences to anybody who resists. And now I feel like they've kind of run out of tactics, okay? They've stripped our laws, they've jailed us, they've beaten us, they've used pepper spray, they've run through the gamut, and now they're like going back to some old tactics. They're like, okay, well, let's try the Red Scare, that did some stuff, so let's try the Green Scare. And I think that they're kind of getting desperate enough. It's like, well, if we can't get them to stop resisting, maybe we can contain them like a virus or something, and we can marginalize them off from mainstream America and say, no, you don't want to be like these people, they're terrorists. And trying to control the messaging of who we are and what the movement is all about. So, okay, that's a long rant. Which leads us into this place where I feel like we're at now, which is acceptance would be the third stage. Is okay, we're in the middle of an ecological crisis. Newspapers around the world are acknowledging this. Okay, maybe not the Oregonian, maybe not papers in America, but every day, if you look at international press, global climate change is the topic. The ecological crisis is the topic. The U.S. being out of control and becoming a fascist state is a topic. The Times Magazine just came out. Climate change is here. Be very afraid. It's a lot of hype. But we're teetering on this edge of acceptance and change, and it's going to take a lot of us standing up to shove it over, because I think we're standing at this place where they're so desperate to maintain their control over their money and their power that they've created. They so desperately are clinging to their old ways. They're just not willing to accept that the people are no longer willing to be stepped on, or no longer willing to allow corporations to destroy which is rightfully ours, the right to breathe clean air and clean water and protect, and have a forest to hike in. And so I think we're faced with a challenge with right now where it's now is the time more than ever to stand up and shove that teeter-totter thing over the edge that way so it doesn't spiral back on us. We're at a scary point where if we allow where they're going in this full-on rage and anger and trying to control us to win, we are going to wind up in a lot of trouble with all of our civil liberties stripped away and in the middle of an ecological crisis that could resemble something out of some horrific, sci-fi movie. But I don't think they're going to win. I think we're going to win because I think they're vulnerable. And I think that that's what we're seeing, even in the Time magazine piece. And I'm so, oh, never mind. I'm not going to try to do quotes. I'm horrible at it. Gandhi said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they beat you, and then you win. And what's John Trudell's thing? You know how effective you're being based on the amount of resistance that you get back. And I think that right now we're saying that we're in this bubbling over point where if we allow them to, and we sit back and we allow them to be afraid, and we're afraid of being called terrorist or being aligned with that word, that we're going to lose a lot more than our civil liberties. But I think if we stand up and start taking all sorts of actions, whatever, we all have our personal niches and our skills. Some people are going to be great at taking over corporate offices and bringing the problem to them. Bring some of the raw sewage into their offices. They know what they're putting into, or what. I'm not advocating breaking any laws. But bring the problem to the people creating the problem. Bring it to the streets. Bring it to the media. Bring it to your neighbors. Go door to door. Talk about the green scare.
Hi, I'm Ben Rosenfeld, and I want to start by thanking the organizers of this in the local chapter of the National Lawyers Guild and the Northwest Constitutional Rights Center. And I think that one of the real dilemmas that we face in the midst of this green scare, which I think is also a red and black scare, which I'll talk about in the sense that it's specifically targeting anarchists. It's kind of a red, black, and green scare, which makes it a very colorful scare. And maybe there's a new flag that we can hoist in response to that, but the FBI certainly marries those concepts when it considers that green anarchists, that is people who have a vision of sustainability and respect for all living beings, pose the greatest domestic security threat to the country right now, and they've said that in their own words. That's not hyperbole. But one of the greatest challenges we face in the midst of this is, on the one hand, the fact we're incredibly chilled. I mean, they're firing over our heads. They're not just firing over our heads, they're firing at a lot of people. Probably people in this room know some of the targets, people who've been indicted who are contemplating decades in prison, people who've been subpoenaed to grand juries, people who are getting show-up visits by the FBI don't know whether the next step is that they're going to be subpoenaed to grand juries or perhaps indicted themselves. So there's an incredible chill in the air, and it's important to respond to that in a couple of ways, and I think having this kind of symposium is one of the critical ways of responding to it. Of course, unfortunately, what it does is it causes a lot of people to stop participating, to lay low, and that's well advised in a lot of cases. I mean, it's a time for a lot of people to sort of lower their profile, lower their signature, to not stand out. But to not sort of be repeater stations of information and gossip and innuendo about who did what. But it's also, of course, a time to form solidarity, to hold public meetings, town halls like this, and to get each other's backs and to sort of drag this cockroach of a process out into the light because it thrives in darkness and secrecy. So I think this is a brilliant idea, and I applaud you, and I thank you for inviting me up here. The reason that the FBI arrogates to itself the right to put informants in this room, and looking around, none of you look like informants to me, but that's part of the point, right? that's the point. But the reason that they arrogate to themselves the right to do that here at the Unitarian Church, in this small gathering, which should in every way be protected by the First Amendment, is because John Ashcroft, General Ashcroft, liberalized what are known as the Attorney General Guidelines. And I'm going to talk more about that later on, but essentially what he did was he said that the FBI shall now have the right to go everywhere the public goes. And that doesn't mean just onto the internet, but that means into churches like this, into people's homes, into group meetings, and so forth. Now, they can claim that they have that authority with, I think, a whiff of legitimacy, or at least they build this kind of legitimacy. I mean, it's built on a very faulty premise, I think, legally, but certainly they're claiming that legitimacy based on this change in the guidelines. And so part of my talk is dedicated to explaining to you some of the specifics about how this arises, because I know that everybody here knows that we're living in an era of, well, for a lot of people, unprecedented surveillance and intrusion into people's private lives and civil liberties. For others in the room, it's a replay of a very bad old movie and harkens back to the darkest days of the Red Scare. It's all coming back around. I know you know that. I know you know that the Patriot Act is evil. But I want to talk to you specifically about some of the mechanics and some of the specific provisions, because none of this arose in a vacuum, of course. And in fact, I think my talk dovetails very well with Kim's. I'm a member of the NLG, and I was reminded as Kim was talking, and Barbara, maybe you can correct me if I don't have the quote exactly right, but the National Lawyers Guild is dedicated to the principle that human rights are more sacred than property interests, not rights, but interests. Is that right? That's right. And mine is to talk to you about the overzealous government oppression of environmental activists. Well, it's not overzealous in their minds. It's underzealous, and it's been underzealous for a long time. And that's because our detractors and perhaps a lot of people who aren't sinister, but maybe are just poorly informed, or maybe they have strong opinions and they just don't agree, believe that property interests are more valuable than human rights. I mean, certainly our government is acting like that. And so while 9/11 was occasioned an absolute sea change in law enforcement, and the Patriot Act contains a lot of very, very dangerous provisions, and I'm not going to go into the details of the Patriot Act, this has been sort of fulminating and developing for a long time. And I think you've all heard, for example, that, I mean, the Patriot Act, which appeared virtually overnight, completely drafted, was a document that they had in their hip pocket, and you know, people have different theories about 9/11 and the Patriot Act, but it's certainly clear that many of the provisions in the Patriot Act are things that they had kind of in development for a long time. And the Patriot Act, even though it makes an easy target, is not the only document, not the only law which has occasioned some of these changes. And for a long time, and actually what I should say is that it is obviously overzealous, but at the same time, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we don't try to step into their shoes and acknowledge why they take it so seriously. I think we have to admit to ourselves that the FBI, jurisdictionally, politically, socially, has no choice but to investigate crimes of sabotage and arson. I don't think it's appropriate to call them acts of terrorism, and that's partly what I'm here to talk about. But we know the FBI is going to investigate these things. And we know in so doing, they're going to use all of the resources at their disposal, which are considerable. We know they're going to go overboard, they're going to cast a wide net, they're going to do a lot of damage to the lives of a lot of innocent people, as well as the direct targets of their investigation. And the other thing, too, is that one feature of some of the recent acts of sabotage has been a level of rhetoric, kind of a peaked rhetoric, which I think has played very well into their hands. For example, while it's true and needs to be said over and over again that these acts have not resulted in injury or death, and that in fact the groups, if you want to call them groups, so they're not exactly groups, who advocate them don't advocate violence. In fact, they work studiously to condemn violence against human life and all life. They go out of their way to avoid it. But there have been communiques, there have been statements, there have been messages which have claimed, I think probably hyperbolically and rhetorically, that the next time the victims might not be property, the victims might be people. I'm thinking notably of an incident in the Bay Area where I'm from, and there are certainly spokespeople who have used a very stepped-up rhetoric themselves and said, for example, that that any means are legitimate means to try to redress animal torture and suffering. Well, the FBI and the other enforcement agencies of the federal government have, on the one hand, they have no choice but to take those kinds of messages seriously. They're charged with the responsibility to do that. On the other hand, since so much of what they do is so politically driven, it's great fodder for them, and they're all too happy to react to those sort of selective and aberrant examples and statements, and to parlay that into all the things they're doing. Increased surveillance, increased use of informants, increased harassment, ridiculous overcharging of people under statutes that carry minimum sentences of 35 years for use of an incendiary device, and rampant issuance of subpoenas to grand juries. So I'm not here to make any moral judgments about that. I'm here simply to say that that there is a context, and that if we're intellectually honest about it, and we should be, because we'll be better prepared, I think, to take effective action, then we have to sort of match our wits against the most cogent arguments on the other side. And there are very cogent arguers for this kind of response, and they include people like Ron Arnold, who Kim mentioned, who's the founder of a group called the Center for Free Enterprise or something like that. I have it in my notes. People who are appearing before Congress, appearing on nightly talk shows, advocating for changes in legislation that will expand definitions of so-called ecoterrorism and animal enterprise crimes. In fact, there's a bill that just passed both houses in Pennsylvania that does exactly that. This is sort of the newest thing on the horizon, and I'll predict, and it's not such a bold prediction, that this is going to snowball, and we're going to see a lot of such legislation coming down the pipe. This awaits the governor's signature in Pennsylvania, and unless that governor is somebody with a lot of spine, and not many governors are, then he probably has almost no choice but to sign it politically. So this doesn't arise in a vacuum. And now, onward, is there a little bit of time left? Okay, onward to talk a little bit about some of the specific developments in the law which have brought us to this point and sort of provided the occasion for this kind of overzealous enforcement. The first is, as many of you are probably aware, to note that until the Patriot Act, there was not a definition of domestic terrorism, at least not in the US statutes. There was one in what are called the Code of Federal Regulations, but there wasn't one which had penalties attached to it. Well, the Patriot Act changed all that, and it didn't just change it. It created a definition of terrorism, which I'll just read to you in a moment, which obviously on its face criminalizes and labels as terrorism behavior which hitherto would have to be understood as pure civil disobedience. The definition is that domestic terrorism means activities that A, involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state, B, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and C, occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the US, which is just there to distinguish it from international terrorism. So look back at this for a moment, note a couple things. One, that it sweeps within its scope activities which appear to be intended to do one of these enumerated things. Not are intended, but appear to be intended. I mean, this is incredibly vague language under any reasonable, rudimentary conception of due process, and it's a grotesquely overbroad statute under the First Amendment too. But it hasn't yet been subjected to any challenge. Well, it's been subjected to one challenge in my research in a civil case, but I think one of the problems is that lawyers too are living in an environment of fear and have been afraid to bring facial challenges to some of these statutes for fear that that given the zeitgeist of the times, the courts will go along with them. But I think personally that, especially with the renewal of Patriot Act provisions that everybody was holding their breath waiting to sunset, I think it's time to simply face up to this. I mean, if we're going to live in a police state, then better that we live in one overtly and that people know it. And so my goal as a lawyer, cynically, has become to win resoundingly. Of course, that's my primary objective, or to lose abjectly, so that people will at least know where things stand. And if nothing else, that might goad people into action. The definition also, as you can tell, sweeps within its scope behavior which is a violation of any laws of the United States or any state. It's hard to know where it stops, but I think you can probably think of manifold examples why acts of simple civil disobedience would fit this definition of terrorism. So the FBI has made it a priority, as most of you also probably know, to investigate animal rights activists, environmental extremists, as it calls people, and anarchists, lumped together in some of their own statements as the #1 domestic security threat facing the nation right now. Now, depending on who they're talking to and what they're saying, there are probably a lot of #1 domestic security threats, so I don't want to overplay that. But clearly, obviously, it's a high priority for them, and they're going after people with a vengeance. They're doing this, as I said, not only with the aid of these new Patriot Act provisions and all the various law enforcement tools that are at their disposal. I mean, we're really through the looking glass in talking about this in constitutional terms. I mean, it's disorienting for a lawyer whose work involves constitutional law to talk about this against the rubric of the Constitution. I mean, it's all flagrantly, patently unconstitutional, even allowing for the elasticity of the reasonableness term in the Fourth Amendment. The Attorney General guidelines, and I think probably I'll stop here because I'm probably running out of time and save and field any questions you have. The Attorney General guidelines are not laws. They're administrative procedures which are written by the Attorney General and are supposed to be adhered to. They sort of provide a law enforcement blueprint for the FBI and other federal law enforcement agencies. These guidelines were first developed in the wake of the COINTELPRO exposure in the 70s. In fact, we just celebrated the exposure of COINTELPRO in 1971. The lore, anyways, is that COINTELPRO was dragged into the light when agents unknown, agents of the people, raided an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, aptly named Media, Pennsylvania, and made off with a bunch of files and then began disseminating these to the public and to various groups. And then Congress held hearings, famously under Senator Church, and reined in these practices, which essentially involved the FBI acting like the CIA or the KGB, committing black bag jobs and break-ins and fomenting division among leaders of groups, and in some of the most egregious cases, suborning the assassination of civil rights leaders, or perhaps even doing it themselves. So the Attorney General guidelines were one of the responses to this. They were first drafted by Attorney General Levy, I think it's Edward Levy, in 1976 in response to the Church Committee hearings. And the purpose of them was to create standards for certain conduct by the FBI. They had to have a criminal predicate. They had to have some focused, reasonable suspicion that a crime was afoot before they opened an investigative file on people. I mean, one of the great perfidies of the FBI is this sort of pure gathering of information. Now, unfortunately, there's very bad case law out there to suggest that mere gathering of information is not so harmful, but some lawyers, including myself, are looking at some affirmative litigation strategies to overcome those obstacles. Among other things, I mean, it's kind of ironic that we might find ourselves arguing this, but it really frustrates your chances of ever working in federal law enforcement if there's ever been an FBI dossier on you. What the FBI is, in a lot of ways, or at least was a massive library system. And I mean, the FBI, famously under Hoover, had I forget what the name of the list was. I mean, it has all these different lists and indexes. And
the Attorney General's list was what it became known as.
Yeah, I mean, they had lists of people they were going to round up if things got really bad. If I guess the red tide maybe started lapping the shores of Alaska, and they had sort of a secondary. They had a secondary list, sort of all the other people they'd go to, it included lawyers and prominent NLG people as well. Anyways, I'm not gonna try to summarize all the changes in the Attorney General guidelines, but they've been edited successively over the years and gradually weakened, both in terms of the standards under which the FBI is allowed to open investigations on individuals and groups, and as well as the standards under which they handle informants. Fast forward to Ashcroft's revisions of the Attorney General guidelines, which is what we're dealing with today, in which there is no longer any standard, although they say, I think, in kind of an act of mere lip service, that they're not allowed to open files on people based purely on the exercise of their First Amendment rights. The ACLU has proven that they're doing this anyway, but apart from that, there's really nothing to restrain them from collecting information, and they do it not just by posting people to listen in on meetings. They're doing it in very aggressive ways, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about this during question and answer, by, for example, trying to insinuate informants into decision-making positions in First Amendment groups. And so I haven't left any time for optimism, but maybe that's just as well. I sat here for a moment and tried to come up with some kind of cheerful remarks to conclude with. I think there's this old saying that I'm really fond of, that every thesis breeds its antithesis. I mean, another way of saying it is the pendulum swings back around. I mean, more people are becoming galvanized and involved. I mean, some of us kind of want to just take to higher ground and go be Taoists, and some of us, I think, who've been fighting for, I don't know, Barbara, I'd be interested in hearing what your response to it all is, but I think there's an argument to be made for sort of, getting out of the floodwaters and getting to higher ground and just hoping that the tide, recedes. But of course, a lot of people, I think, are becoming active for the first times, and I think there is reason to hope that that this thesis will breed its antithesis.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to thank everybody for being here, and for the National Lawyers Guild for putting this on. And it's an honor to speak with people with so much intelligence and experience and inspiration to provide. I'd like to say it's important. I'm going to have a pretty different sort of subject to talk to. It's in stark contrast to what Ben was talking about. It's about the lack of focus by our federal government and our state government and our local governments on pursuing crimes committed against the environment rather than those committed for the environment, which is basically the topic of all these panels. So I want to have some specific examples of that. The presence of everybody in this room is kind of an indication that there are a lot of people in our society who consider there to be much more important, much more frequent, and much more costly crimes than those for which there are 11 accused people, and the subject of Alberto Gonzalez's press conference. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The government basically turns a nearly blind eye to crimes committed against the environment, and I think Kim was illustrating that pretty well in your opening. And the pattern of hypocrisy of pursuing with such vigor people who commit relatively small crimes on behalf of the environment versus huge crimes. Kim quoted 50% of our waters aren't fit to swim in. I work for an environmental group that is concerned with the health of our waters, and it's a pretty stunning figure, and it's one that I've seen, ranging from 40 to 50. So in either case, that's an enormous impact on people's lives, and it's enormous economic impact, and something that obviously far outstrips in scale anything that 11 people could or could not do. The pattern is obviously permeates our corporate culture. Our government doesn't prosecute corporate crime with the same vigor. It prosecutes people, victims of the Green Scare, and it also doesn't prosecute crimes against humanity, and Iraq would be a glaring example of that. But I'm going to stick mostly to water in Oregon because that's what I know sort of the best, and the lax enforcement on polluters. And I think it makes a really good and direct contrast with the kind of attention that Ben was talking about people receiving. There are a lot of different ways in which the government is not paying attention, not enforcing environmental laws. I'm going to use the Clean Water Act in Oregon as kind of my example, but the same is true for soil and for air. Ben's from San Francisco. I've got an example of, I was just talking to a friend of mine who used to do research in East Palo Alto, and she was telling me about a park in the Baylands of East Palo Alto, mostly minority neighborhood, where there are no benches. I said, well, why are there no benches? And said, there are no benches because the soil is so toxic, they can't allow anyone to use the area any more than transient use. So if you live in East Palo Alto, beware of your Baylands Park. There's a huge toxic plume underneath that area. And I was in San Francisco actually recently talking with people from Long Beach who are facing liquefied natural gas development, similar to the ones we're facing here in Oregon. Some of you might know about that. And they were talking about the fact that those projects have been promoted as clean for them, and it's such a contrast. Introducing a huge amount of environmental impact into the Lower Columbia or even Coos Bay. These are negative impacts there. Liquefied natural gas is relatively cleaner because it doesn't have the same air quality impacts as other industries, and so it's being sold to them. And they saw right through it because they know it's dangerous. But they're existing in an environment with high asthma rates, high rates of respiratory problems. But coming back to Oregon and water, there are a lot of hardworking people who are already working on environmental issues in Oregon, and I hope to continue to work on them despite the Green Scare. But the regulatory framework at both the state and national level is being increasingly rigged to benefit water polluters. While our federal, state, and local governments make this huge show of prosecuting, Green Scare people, the pattern of neglect for enforcement of laws governing our water shows the government really has no interest in promoting public health, safety, or even a reasonably economically feasible solution to who should pay for the severe public costs of pollution. You can think of this kind of as like prosecutorial discretion, to use a pretty loose analogy. The people who make the laws in Oregon are basically the governor and the DEQ and the people they listen to. The enforcement comes from the DEQ, and they have this sort of discretion, and the criminals are the industries that hold extreme sway with the first two groups. In comparison between crimes that the government is interested in prosecuting and those that aren't, the world of pollution enforcement is one in which the criminals set the rules, induce the enforcers to bend the rules, and subsequently break the rules with impunity. I'm going to illustrate that with an example. I'm from Oregon City. I'm a hometown, homegrown boy here. And ever since I was a kid, the quality of the Willamette River has been sort of a joke. Someone in my family, a bunch of brothers, and they would say, "Yeah, let's go swimming in the Willamette," and everybody would laugh and stop, and then we'd all go to the Clackamas River, the Upper Clackamas, where the water's a lot cleaner. We swim and fish and recreate not in the Willamette. And in the realm of eco-crimes, I consider the pollution of the Willamette to be pretty high on the list, and there's a lot of people, and some of them might be in this room, who know a lot about that, the riverkeeper groups, NEDC, and others. But I'll use, as an example, Blue Heron Paper Company, Smurfit in my heart, because that's the name it was when I was growing up. Always be Smurfit to me. It has a permit from DEQ that was to expire right now to discharge turbid water at 40 NTUs. So that's, it's pretty cloudy water into the Willamette River. They were given 4 3/4 years to comply with this, meaning for that period of time they were allowed to discharge water at 5 times that level. And that was about 4.75 years ago. So it was up right now. And instead of bringing them into compliance with the compliance schedule, intuitive, and they were given another 4.5 years to discharge the water at the higher level. I mean, it's just an example of how the rules are bent to favor polluters. And the Willamette River is dirty, not just because of blue heron and bent rules, but for a lot of reasons. And I think that it's more than just specific permits being changed. It's about the DEQ. Basically, it's about the structure of permits in general, too. DEQ is proposing to formalize this type of flexibility for permit holders by changing our water clarity laws. As another example, there are toxicity laws also. There are laws about temperature. But just take turbidity, and they want to create areas of our public rivers where you're allowed to discharge any water at any clarity, and those would basically be open sewers to allow this mixing area for industrial effluent to come into compliance with our rules. That seems counterintuitive to me, that any public resource would be used in that manner. And incidentally, this research and the change in the rules are funded and initiated by the pulp and paper industry. So polluters have lax permits. There's a climate of increasingly relaxed regulation, and despite that, polluters regularly violate the terms of their permits. So the law is arranged in a way that it's very difficult to substantively address the underlying crisis that's going on in our waters, and the same would be true for our land and air. And to sort of exemplify that, the Public Interest Research Group has reported that more than 62% of major municipal and industrial polluters or holder permits are in violation or were in violation of their permits at some point between July 03 and December 04. That's an 18-month period, and that you can kind of see why 40 or 50% of our waters aren't fit to interact with, and the cost of that is, I would estimate to be pretty astronomical. Kim also mentioned that a lot of the fines that happen are kind of slap on the wrist type things. The Clean Water Act violations can be up to $32,000 per violation per day. But because of the way things are carried out, fines don't reach that scale. I mean, the fact that was written into the legislation shows that the law was meant to be enforced, and our waters were meant to be cleaner than they are, and they're not being maintained in that respect. And I consider that, personally, I consider that to be what I call it a crime. I think it's a crime the Willamette's not, is such a mess. And that's sort of, maybe it's a different definition of crime, but I don't think that the definition of crime or terrorism being used by our government is particularly rigorous either. So I'll just use that flexibility. So beyond there being polluters like blue heron, there are all kinds of polluters that actually violate the permits. There was a story in the Oregonian a few months ago about NEDC, and basically stated they had outperformed DEQ in both discovering and enforcing permit violations, and then all of Oregon's enforcement. So you'd think that if you're going to hand over enforcement to citizen groups and basically have community policing of our environmental problems, and you try to make that easier. Instead, it's getting more difficult. There's fees to access permits or monitoring reports. There's no automated system to detect permit violations. They're filed on paper, which is kind of remarkable when you consider, in contrast, how much effort is put into logging the emails. I'm sure of half the people in this room, or all those 11 people who are being charged. They can't find an automated system to detect permit violations, even though they're written down, just comparing numbers. Mixing zones are very difficult to monitor. It's hard to find, outpouring, where things are actually, the actual outflows for industrial facilities. On public lands, the problem is similar. Grazing permits, for instance, are allowed to violate the terms of their permits over and over. There's, different groups have tried to organize people to go out and catalog these problems. Flow, KS Wild, ONDA, and a bunch, other groups also. And at least, try to get people to be in compliance with their permits. I mean, the scope of the problem is pretty intense. It's pretty wide, and we get to an underlying situation where the polluters never pay. And in that climate, coming back to sort of the capitalism part that you brought up, right to start with, there's no way to what economists call internalize the externality. There are costs that come with pollution. And pollution often in violation of our laws that aren't ever paid. As an example of that, the largest Superfund site in America, in Butte, Montana, it's BP ARCO is allowed not to fully clean up their site because the EPA has decided, well, it's impossible. And Superfund is another law that's being gutted, and we have large stretches of the Willamette in the Portland metropolitan area that have Superfund sites. And it's just another example. All of this, by the way, is taking its toll on the people who work for agencies that are supposed to enforce our environmental laws. EPA scientists are increasingly distrustful of their own enforcement agencies, and the EPA is relaxing criminal enforcement, which has the direct effect of giving a comparative advantage in our current capitalist system. Oh, okay, got 15 minutes. In our current system to people who pollute. So the price is never paid, and I think that everybody in this room, I'm going to end just by saying, we have a different idea of who the criminals are, and I think it's important that we just stand up and say it.
When you look at all the range of environmental organizations out there who are trying to protect the planet in one form or another, they do have some very strong things in common. Sometimes they don't act that way, which is what my job is, I think, to talk about. One of the things that we do, I think, all try to do within the environmental movement is to enforce what few pathetic environmental laws we do have in this country, because the government is not enforcing them. I mean, that is what we just heard, and it is obviously true. So many environmental organizations take it upon themselves, one way or another, to enforce the laws that exist. And they can do that, we can do that in a number of ways. You can do it through litigation. There's certainly enough lawyers out there in the environmental organizations that are trying to litigate to mandate the federal agencies or the state agencies to enforce the laws. You can do it through bearing witness. You can do it through basically calling media attention and other public attention to the fact that these laws aren't being enforced. Or you can put your body in the way of those who are trying to destroy the planet. All of those are valid tactics. I used to be the director of Greenpeace US, and Greenpeace, while it avoids property destruction, does engage openly and confidently in nonviolent civil disobedience, which we internationally call bearing witness. It is a way to bring media attention to the crimes against the planet. Between 1971, when Greenpeace was formed, and 2001, I left in 1997, so between 1971 and 2001, Greenpeace regularly took inflatable boats and blocked nuclear submarines, got in the way of nuclear missile tests, got in the way of whaling ships, got in the way of chemical shipments, shipments of hazardous waste, and so on. We never once in those 30 years faced felony charges anywhere in the world. Never once. After George Bush became president, in August of 2001, We're not talking after September 2001. In August of 2001, a group of Greenpeace activists blocked or entered the waters, tried to block, and did delay for 40 minutes anyhow, an illegal test of the Star Wars missiles that were being shot off somewhere near Vandenberg Air Force Base. They got into the water, they were there openly enough that the test had to be delayed. They were charged with felonies. They were facing 11 years each and $500,000 in fines. The missile test, as I say, was in direct violation of international law. However, Greenpeace, because this came to trial, this was August of 2001, because it came to trial after September 2001, after September 11th, Greenpeace was looking in the face of a very changed country, and certainly a very changed legal climate, where simply being called, not being charged with, but being called terrorists was all of a sudden upping the ante dramatically. And in the face of that, Greenpeace agreed to a civil injunction where, as an organization, they agreed for 5 years to not go near any missile tests in any US naval or Air Force facilities. They also, the 17 pled to misdemeanors, but I mean, that's kind of comes with the territory. Anyone who works for Greenpeace pleads to a lot of misdemeanors. That was in January of 2002. In April 2002, Greenpeace activists boarded a ship in the harbor of, it was actually, I think, 6 miles out of the harbor of Miami, that was bringing in illegally cut mahogany from Brazil. It was illegally cut under Brazilian law. It was being imported illegally under US law and under international law. They boarded the ship just to hang a banner. I mean, what does Greenpeace do, right? It hangs banners. So it boarded the ship in order to hang a banner. Those activists were arrested, they were held by the Coast Guard, they were charged, they were, let go for time served, and they were gone. 15 months later, Greenpeace, the organization, was indicted by John Ashcroft and the federal government for boarding a vessel before it arrives in port and conspiring to board a vessel before it arrives in court, because boarding the vessel is a misdemeanor. Conspiring to do it is a felony. So the organization was now being charged with a felony. This law about boarding a vessel before it arrives in port was a law that was passed in 1872 to prevent prostitutes from brothels to come out and board ships before they actually made it into port. It had been used twice in the years since 1872, and in both instances the judges had thrown it out as a joke. It was called sailor mongering, my favorite term. So, in this instance, I think Greenpeace had calmed down a little bit and learned the lesson of the new era, and decided to fight rather than to plead to anything. And so they fought the charges. They put front and center the fact that the mahogany was illegal, that importing the mahogany was illegal, that it had landed, then that same ship had gone on and offloaded the mahogany in Charleston, South Carolina, and it had gone out into the marketplace. And so they basically made it very clear that they were going to put that front and center as their reason for sailor mongering. And they also made a joke of it. They also got every environmental organization in the country, as well as the ACLU and Al Gore and a few others, to say how absurd this was, and dangerous it was, and chilling it was for the organization to be prosecuted, because not only was Greenpeace going to be fined, I can't remember the amount, it was like $100,000, but they also were going to lose their tax-exempt status, which is a valuable commodity for environmental organizations of a certain sort. Some of them don't bother with that kind of corporate structure. So 2 years later, the case was thrown out by the federal judge in Miami, the federal district court judge, as it should have been. Shortly thereafter, the Rainforest Action Network received a subpoena from the House Ways and Means Committee to submit all of its records about all of the civil disobedience in which it had engaged, with the names of all the activists who had engaged in civil disobedience in the name of the Rainforest Action Network for the last, I forget the term, I think it was since its inception, but perhaps not. Now, think about that for a moment. That's the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee is subpoenaing records about civil disobedience from the Rainforest Action Network in order to test the validity of their nonprofit status. This is what our Congress is doing. Rainforest Action Network went through consulting lawyers, as people do, and unfortunately the lawyers advised them to comply with the subpoena, which they did to some extent. They redacted, as we say in the law, the names of all of the activists, but they did provide materials as opposed to just saying to the House Ways and Means Committee, stuff it. And so, of course, Ways and Means comes back and wants more and wants more and wants more. The only thing that has stopped that investigation is that the House of Representatives has a few other problems. Their minority leader just got himself indicted, and things are going badly in the House of Representatives. So they're a little distracted at the moment. Whether they will come back to this or not is a question. So far, nobody that I know of, and maybe you know differently, has actually been charged with domestic terrorism as an eco-terrorist, or has been charged with anything called eco-terrorism.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the name.
Yeah. I mean, despite all the language that we hear in the press, these provisions that could possibly be used in the Patriot Act about, quote, domestic terrorism have not been used against any environmental activists. And yet we continue, and the word eco-terrorism appears nowhere except in the press. It is not a term that appears, it appears nowhere in the Patriot Act. It may now start to appear in these state laws that people are trying to pass, and that just got passed in Pennsylvania. There's a conservative legislative group that is fomenting these laws from state to state, and we went through ours in Oregon 2 years ago and managed to kill it in our state legislature. That would have been even more ridiculous than the Patriot Act in terms of the breadth of definition of terrorism. It's if you are with anybody who is involved in acts dangerous to human life. It really got very carried away, but we were able to knock it down for then. But it's in the press that this so-called eco-terrorism stuff gets played out. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, Lord, now, a couple of students of mine were indicted for arson of a logging truck, and they were, in the press, indicted for eco-terrorism. And the Attorney General of the United States, as well as the FBI chief here, of the chief of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, as well as the U.S. Attorney here, had a press conference where they were about eco-terrorism. The word came up at least 5 times in the course of that press conference. They tried doing that as well when they got into court. And the federal judge, finally said, if you use that term one more time in my courtroom, I'm throwing out these charges. Because there is nothing in the complaint that says anything about terrorism. These 2 defendants are charged with arson, which is a very different thing. But of course, when you add on this terrorism panache to it, what do? You terrify other environmental activists. And that was exactly their intent. That plus the fact that back then, which was 2002, they were having a little trouble finding Osama bin Laden. So they had to find some terrorist somewhere. And that really is what is going on with all of this. It's like this face-saving thing. There are no arrests of terrorists who really are about to blow up anything of any human beings. So instead, they want to whip up this fear of terrorism because it is how they get to control the population. All right, we've been around that block. I think you've heard enough of that from all of us. But terrorism, in many ways, has become the new un-Americanism, the new Red Scare, as everyone's saying, the Green Scare now. And I think it would be very useful for us to go back and visit for a moment how activists in the 30s and 40s and 50s responded when the real Red Scare, the original Red Scare, was going on. Because we have, I think, a lot of lessons we can learn. I don't think we are reacting to the current climate as well as we could. And I think it's important that we talk about it together. One of the debates that went on within the Communist Party of the United States in the 1950s, when the Smith Act was in its heyday, the Smith Act prohibited belonging to a political party that advocated, again, sounds like the First Amendment, but wasn't, advocated the overthrow of the US government. Okay? So,
And still does, I think.
and still does, yes. So there was a Communist Party. You might not have read about that in your history books. It was a very active party. And a lot of people were indicted or were frightened about the possibility of being indicted under the Smith Act. There were two factions, basically, within the Communist Party. There was a real debate that happened of how do we respond to these indictments. People's lives were being turned on their heads. People with families, people with jobs. Their lives were being turned upside down. I'm not talking about the McCarthy hearings now. That was a different matter. This was real criminal indictments. That was just, well, okay. So, there was the New York faction and the California faction, but you don't need to know the details. But the first group of people who were indicted went underground. The reaction to that was that the American public figured they must have something on these folks. If they are hiding, if they are running and hiding underground, there's something truthful about what the government is saying about the Communist Party and about these individuals. The California faction took a look at that and saw what was going on, and it was a different group of people, different personalities, and they said, screw this, we're not going underground, we're going to go on trial. We are going to say who we are and what we believe and why we do what we do. That we are labor organizers, that we are community organizers who happen to believe that capitalism is the wrong economic system for this country, and we're going to talk about that in court. And we are also going to say that the First Amendment of the United States of the United States Constitution is a very, very precious thing to all of us. And that we stand by our First Amendment rights of association and freedom of speech, and we are going to stand up before the American public and before the judges and talk about it. And they brought about the finding by the Supreme Court that the Smith Act is unconstitutional because they stood up to it. And that's what we have to do. We have to be open, we have to be public about what we are doing and why we are doing it. When Greenpeace was willing to say, we boarded this ship, yes, because that mahogany was cut illegally, any jury would have acquitted them. They didn't even have to get to a jury. The judge directed a verdict. The other piece of this is that we have to stand by each other. It is true that different organizations and different individuals buy into different tactics of how we are going to enforce the environmental laws that our government is not enforcing, how we are going to stand up against those who are destroying our environment illegally and immorally. But when people are under attack, we have to stand together. And it doesn't mean you have to say, I accept their tactics. It doesn't mean you have to say anything about arson or anything about anything that specific acts that other people committed. You have to say the crimes against the environment are very serious crimes. These acts that people are committing are not terrorism. When my two students were indicted, we went to the faculty senate. I, with a couple of other professors, went to the faculty senate, and we got a resolution passed by the faculty senate, not because the Portland State University faculty senate has any influence with John Ashcroft or anybody else, even the city council, but because we wanted to force the faculty to go on record saying, and I'll just read you what they said. The Faculty Senate of Portland State University affirms that active political participation is not only the right but the responsibility of all citizens of a democratic country, that statements and actions of public officials which explicitly or implicitly question the legitimacy of political dissent or which gratuitously link activism to terrorism have a predictably chilling effect on the willingness of PSU students, faculty, and staff, and all the other residents of Portland to exercise their democratic and constitutional rights. And then we called on all the public officials we could name to refrain and direct others in their employ to refrain from making any further statements or taking any actions which discourage political participation, dissent, or nonviolent political action, or which prejudice the right to a fair trial of any accused persons. We got the Portland State faculty to pass that. We have to go to all of our organizations and all of our churches and all of our official bodies and force them to take a public stand against calling these indictees and these defendants terrorists. They are not terrorists. They may be people who believe in anarchist acts. They may be people who believe in nonviolent direct action. They may be people who believe in direct action that is not so nonviolent, but they are not terrorists. And if we don't take that stand, then they will come after us next. Thank you.